Welcome, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I should put on my headphones, as I noticed an echo. Hopefully that's better. I hope everyone's doing well. My name is Triandafyllidou. I'm an associate professor of political science at the University of Toronto Scarborough and at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Thank you very much for joining us today for the fourth talk in our Hellenic Studies seminar series this academic year. On behalf of everyone involved in the program, I thank the Hellenic Heritage Foundation for its strong support of our efforts. I also thank the director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, Professor Randall Hansen, and my dedicated and brilliant colleagues, Professors Themis Saravositas, Spiros Kotsovilis, and Robert Austin. And all of us are very grateful for Daria Dumbadze's assistance in helping us beam today's seminar to all of you via Zoom and to surmount the challenges of the pandemic. Our fifth and final session in the series will be in April. We're just confirming the date, but it looks like it'll be in early April. And the theme will be around Greece's new economy. So venture capital, startups, and the new digital entrepreneurship. More details to come shortly. But today, I'm truly delighted to introduce our special guest, Professor Anna Triandafyllidou. Professor Triandafyllidou is the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Ryerson University, one of our partners here in the city of Toronto. She is an internationally recognized sociologist and migration policy expert whose interdisciplinary research focuses on the governance of migration and asylum, as well as the management of cultural diversity, nationalism and identity issues, and contemporary challenges of migration and integration across world regions. Prior to taking up her chair at Ryerson, Anna was based in Florence, Italy, where she held a Robert Schuman Chair at the European University Institute and directed the EUI's Cultural Pluralism Research Area as part of its institute's, as part of the EUI's Global Governance Program. Speaking on behalf of my fellow migration researchers, both faculty and students here in Toronto, I want to thank Anna for her outstanding contributions to our field. Anna is truly a global academic superstar, and we're very, very lucky that she has made Toronto her home. The title of Professor Triandafyllidou's talk is Voting with Their Feet, Emigration from Greece in the 2010s. Anna will speak for roughly 40 to 50 minutes, and then we will happily take your questions. Please post your questions through the Q&A tool of Zoom. Professor Triandafyllidou, please begin.
Professor Triandafyllidou, dear Phil, thank you very much, and thank you all for making the time. True, it would have been a lot better if we could have been in person rather than on Zoom, but still Zoom is better than nothing, and I'm very glad to be with you today. I think Phil was a little too generous in my presentation. I don't think I'm so important, and I'm very happy to be here. Actually, I'm not going to be speaking strictly about myself, about the new Greek immigrants in Canada, as probably I'm too recent to speak about myself in relation to the cohort that I'm presenting and the study that I will be presenting. But I'll be happy also to give anecdotal and personal reflections towards the end of the seminar. And it's, as I said, it's a great pleasure to be in Toronto and a great honor and to join the seminar, and also to have made Ryerson my new academic home. So without further ado, I'd like to share my screen. Yeah, here we are. Yeah, here we are. So the title of this presentation is tellingly Voting with Their Feet, Emigration from Greece in the 2010s. And actually the title comes from a paper that we had published with Ruby Gropas a few years back, which was exactly about new Greek emigration in the early and mid 2010s, not just from Greece, but also from all Southern European countries, actually including Spain, Italy, and Portugal, although the different countries, we should say, have experienced different levels, if you want, of crisis, of economic crisis and public financial crisis. And probably, unfortunately, Greece won the championship in terms of, the most acute crisis, particularly in the Eurozone. But you will be surprised to find out that it was the Portuguese that were more mobile rather than the Greeks. And actually, this is a really quite a significant part of the focus of the study that I will be presenting, because what I'm asking in a way, and that what has been a theme also that relates more generally, more broadly to my work, also current work, not necessarily regarding Greeks, is how voluntary is voluntary highly skilled migration, and how do we make sense of people's decision making? Because it may seem as obvious that highly skilled people have the luxury, if you want, to decide what they want to do, where they want to go. And we know that in terms of migration regimes, there are those coveted. Actually, in a conference that we had online, of course, at Ryerson last week, in one of the panels, we're talking about the global race for talent. And that's usually how we think of highly skilled migrants. At the same time, particularly in Canada, we know that the picture is not always rosy. And we also know that this notion of voluntariness should be nuanced. Also, the other thing is we tend often to think that highly skilled people are rational actors. So they make, before deciding to migrate, they probably do some sort of cost-benefit analysis. And again, we forget that this decision-making is not rational in the pure sense of the terms, and that also both both highly skilled and less skilled migrants do not have full information. So they move on the basis of expectations that they have about what happens at destination, but also on the basis of hopes, and desires. And that is very important. And I would like to say that beyond this particular study that we'll present on Greeks, there is a burgeoning literature on this issue, which, however, focuses more on irregular migrants and asylum seekers, basically trying to respond to the question that would often come to the minds, particularly of those who don't work on migration research, which is how come people go through such hardship, through such risks, and engage in irregular migration. How is it that they make, this desire and this aspiration is so strong that it makes them, ignore all the risks and all the costs? Let me, however, go back to the case of Greece and to what I want to present today as a more specific case study of this general, problematique. And I'll remind us, the painful context of the Eurozone crisis in the mid-2010. It's also a very interesting, I thought, in a way, it's very interesting, some of the talk that we hear today in Canada in relation to the pandemic crisis makes me sometimes reflect about the Eurozone crisis and that, difficult period in Greece and throughout, I would say, Southern Europe and Ireland, because when I hear that the GDP of Canada has actually decreased by 5%, so it's minus 5% in 2020 compared to 2019, you might be surprised to find out that the worst year in Greece during the Eurozone crisis was 2011, and the contraction was minus 9%. And actually, what is also interesting is that the growth that came after that was really very, very, how can I say, weak. So we're talking about 0.7% growth in 2012 or 13. So it was really a protracted crisis. Also, the unemployment rate was pretty high, although again and again, I'm sometimes putting these things in context, thinking of the current situation in Canada. So you probably know that in Canada, our unemployment rate before the pandemic, so say in January, February 2020, was around 5%, 4.7% in BC, maybe 5% in Toronto, 5.2% in some other provinces. And currently stands near 10%, or actually around 9% at this moment. It is interesting to say that in Greece and in several Southern European countries, unemployment was between 8 and 11% when the financial crisis and then the Eurozone crisis, and then it rose to over 20%. But I've put in this slides particularly some data on youth unemployment, because I think this is particularly important for the people we're looking at and that we studied in that research. And that was so people who qualify as youth, so who are under 30 years of age. And you can see that in 2015, overall, in the different countries, youth unemployment was plus 10% compared to the same data for 2008, but particularly looking at the EU 28, it was on average 20%, which is still pretty high, but in Greece it was nearly 50%, in Spain 40%, and in Italy 32%. The question, of course, also arises, and I think perhaps many of the people in this virtual room know this through anecdotal evidence, is that the Eurozone crisis did not affect all Greek citizens in the same way. So we have data from colleagues in social policy that look into the different facets of the crisis. And we know that the situation was most acute. Poverty increased mostly for people who were unemployed, for those who were self-employed, those particularly who were renting their accommodation or still paying mortgage, not least because the prices of real estate decreased rapidly, and people were found to pay huge mortgages for houses that even if they sold, they wouldn't be able to pay back the remaining part of their mortgages. The crisis was more acute in Athens as a big urban center, perhaps also because of the lesser importance of immediate family networks or possibilities of providing accommodation and making ends meet through extended family, and it was more felt. So poverty increased more among young adults up to 29 years of age. So that paints a pretty bleak picture in terms of what was the situation in Greece, and of course, there would be no surprise if we saw a significant, wave of emigration from Greece and also from the other Southern European countries. So here comes the surprise, and that might run counter to what you expected to hear today. So generally, if we look at the size of the crisis and also at the fact that it was protracted, and we'll hear about it in terms of the motivation of people who actually left, Greeks were pretty immobile. They generally did not move. Actually, perhaps the question that we need to ask is why people did not leave the country rather than why they left and who left, which is what I'm going to talk about. And this was very much part of the motivation when we started this project. I was, at the time I lived in Italy, and we started this project looking at all the Southern European countries, because if you think, and again, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the European context, and particularly the European context in the 90s, if we look at emigration from Central and Eastern Europe after 1989, with the collapse of the communist regimes, then the significant political and economic transformation that happened in those countries in the 90s, emigration was much higher in absolute and in relative terms, and it also touched upon segments of the population that we would not have expected to see, and that we did not see in the 2010s when we look at Greek or other Southern European emigration. So as you probably know, Central and Eastern Europe, I mean, we had, for instance, middle-aged women leaving their families behind in Central Eastern Europe and moving to Western or Southern Europe. So we see two important elements, two important novelties here. So one is the change of direction of intra-EU migration, so migration within the European Union. Instead of east to west, we have a significant migration from south to north. And I would add to this the exception of Ireland, even though Ireland actually recovered from the crisis faster than the Southern European crisis, but during the early 2010s, we can put Ireland in the same basket. And then, of course, the question is why people migrate and why they do not migrate and who leaves. And here too, I want to point your attention to one additional aspect of this, which is that when we look at the relationship, and we looked at this research that I'm presenting, at the relationship between unemployment, so the rise of unemployment, and the emigration of, so the net migration from the Southern European countries, what we see is that the data can be misleading because net migration included foreigners who lived in these countries. So when you look at the graph, we can see that it is important to make the distinction between total net emigration and the emigration of nationals, which is much lower. And you can actually see that it is much lower, particularly in Greece, if you think of, again, of the acuteness of the crisis compared to other countries. So this also, again, poses the problem of what drove new Greek emigration in the 2000s and why people actually were immobile rather than mobile. And let me here take a step backwards and speak a little bit about the analytical framework and the reflections that drive this kind of research. So first of all, these days, I mean, we used to speak, and many theories in the past spoke about push and pull factors of migration. And you can imagine what these are. So pull factors are, perspectives of employment, of higher earnings, better education, better health, better quality of life, etc. And push factors are, in a way, the negative aspect of this. So unemployment, poverty, underemployment, poor quality of life, poor social protection, etc. Also instability, insecurity, etc. But what we have seen in recent research is that notion of push and pull factors, or if you want, of cost and benefit analysis, is not sufficiently dynamic, and that we need to look at the drivers. So we need to look at these factors in a more relational way, and that we need to pay attention not only to the resources that people have, and how they put them to fruition to migrate, but also take a step back and look at their cognitive capacity to think about migration, to plan migration, and then their capability to move. And that is why migration studies in the last, I would say, 10 years or 5 to 10 years, we speak about the capacity to aspire and capability to move. So in terms of capacity to aspire is the very possibility of thinking of migration as a way forward when you're faced with adversity, economic, social, or political adversity. And of course, research has shown that this capacity has to do with the level of education, with the availability of information, which, as you can imagine, in the recent times through internet has significantly increased. And I would say, particularly in the European Union, we may speak of the importance of the European public sphere. So in the sense of a more kind of unified level of public and political discourse, the increased information and commentary about what happens in different European countries that we get in all these countries, increased prominence of the discourse about Brussels, and I say Brussels in inverted commas, so about the European Union, the European institutions, the EU policies. We can say that this has an important implication in the capacity of people to think about migration towards other EU countries. And then, of course, we turn to the capability to move, and then we know that what is important is networks, particularly, kinship or extended friendship networks that are transnational, professional networks that again in the EU may be more expanded because people may have more interaction in their jobs with those living in other EU countries. Of course, financial resources that a migrant can mobilize when moving. And last but not least, again, in intra-EU migration, a very important asset is EU citizenship. As you know, people who have the citizenship of one of the member states of the European Union have EU citizenship. So among other things, they have the right to move freely within the EU and go and reside in another country and work in that country. So in a way, we may see this as an equivalent of moving between provinces in Canada. Now, going back to the decision making, I think it is important to say that generally what social psychology teaches us is that people don't make rational decisions, they make reasonable decisions. So people do not have, first of all, complete and full information. They don't have perfect information when deciding whether they want to migrate. Second, they don't sit down with paper and pencil and do a cost and benefit calculation. Also, as migration theory teaches us, the costs are not just economic, the costs of migrations are social and emotional, and they're very important, and they cannot be, how can I say, calculated in that sense. And last but not least, I think it is important to say that oftentimes people make a decision driven by, as I said, often emotional and other non-rational factors, and then they seek for information that will reinforce their decision. And this is what I mean in terms of reasonable decisions, which are also influenced, for instance, by values and culture. So in many countries, we speak about the culture of migration that can be important in shaping eventually the decisions and the actions of people. When we look specifically at the case of Greece, also, and we look at the structural elements that have provided the push or the drivers that concern Greece as regards immigration, and particularly when we're thinking about highly skilled people, we know that in Greece, and as several studies that the colleague from Thessaloniki, Lois Labrianidis, has done, we see that there is generally a low demand for professionals and persistently low, weak demand for professionals. And also generally, and that is hidden in my PowerPoint, there is low returns for education. So compared to other countries, there's low returns in terms of your educational capital. Now, further trying to understand why people move and how they make their decisions, another element that is important is that of relative deprivation. Now, relative deprivation, again, is has been a concept used in economics to speak about the fact that the notion of deprivation and the notion of rewards and the expected rewards versus the actual rewards is a socially constructed notion. So like, if you want, poverty is a socially constructed notion. So what it means to be poor in Canada is not the same as what it means to be poor, say, in Ecuador or maybe in Nigeria. So similarly, deprivation, so the fact of not having what you aspire to have, is a socially constructed notion. And how much more? It's not only socially constructed within a given context, but it's also relational. So the question is, if I have what I aspire to have by reference, by comparison to my reference group. And usually our reference groups are our local communities. They can be our neighborhood, our small town, our co-ethnic group, of course, or if you want, the people in our country. So in a world organized in nation states, obviously our reference groups are fellow nationals. But as I was saying before, in the EU, we should not underestimate the importance of the emergence of a European public sphere, which creates, I would say, a reference group that is fellow Europeans. And particularly, again, thinking about the education, experiences and opportunities that many young people have had in the last 20 to 25 years to travel to Europe through several of the EU-funded programs like Erasmus, and what was the other one, Comenius, programs that start from the middle school and go all the way to university, and of course to graduate education, for instance. So suddenly for people, the reference groups are other EU citizens, and this is particularly the case for what we would call people who are middle class. Another element that I think needs to not to be neglected is that of mobility as a narrative. I think in the EU, what we've witnessed, at least in the past, maybe 10 to 15 years, is that almost intra-EU mobility is becoming a narrative. So young people aspire to move within the EU, and mobility, so geographical mobility, if you want, is seen as part of socioeconomic mobility, and the two are intertwined. So, and oftentimes it has also been seen in a very rosy situation, a rosy picture, neglecting those times that mobility doesn't work out, that those times when educational or professional plans do not work well, and people there, so the plan of mobility fails. And I would say that is important to remember, because oftentimes, particularly people who have studied abroad and stayed abroad, or who have studied abroad and then come back, so what I call here the stayers abroad and the repatriates, present mobility in a very rosy picture, and also, of course, bring with them different orientations and values. So their expectations, their experiences, but also their expectations have been shaped by this experience of mobility. And that's where relative deprivation can become particularly acute, because they realize, or that is what they realized at the time in the early and mid 2010s, their situation in Greece in particular, but if you want also across the Southern European countries that we examined, had changed. So they felt particularly disadvantaged. I think this is a very important point in understanding our findings, because it was not the poor that left Greece, it was not the unemployed. What we found in the study that I will present in a minute is that the people who left often were people who were employed. So the results that I'm presenting come from an online survey that we conducted in 2013, which had over 6,000 respondents from the 4 countries, not just from Greece. So from Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece. And of those, just under 1,000 were respondents from Greece. I want to explain that this was not a representative sample. So what we did is we created the online survey, and we distributed it through various points of entry, including we managed in all 4 countries to have the survey publicized through one main newspaper. And the online version, so people who were reading the article could quickly click on and go to the survey. So in Greece, that was the case of Kathimerini. In Spain, I think it was El Mundo. In Italy, it was Corriere della Sera. And I think it was also Sole 24 Ore, which is a journal that is a kind of like the Financial Times, the equivalent, and I don't remember what was the journal in Portugal. And of course, we distributed through Facebook groups, through our own acquaintances and our emailing lists, etc. So I believe we had a really good variety of respondents, and we reached out to many people, but certainly it was not representative. And surprise, surprise, I think that we can clearly say it was not representative, because among our respondents, nearly 90%, 88% had college education or higher. And I think that was, obviously that is well beyond any kind of national average that can hover between 25% actually in Italy and 35%. I think Greece stands around 30% of people who are above 25 years of age and have completed higher education. In our survey, again, there was 38% women respondents, which I think, of course, doesn't necessarily reflect how many people left, but is a good representation of women. So we have no particular reason to believe that our results were skewed in relation to gender. And in any case, I think what we tried to, of course, we would have hoped to have a representative sample, but that was not possible. And the reason is that actually the people we interviewed were people that had already left. Actually, I want to say that initially the respondents were nearly 10,000, but we had to clean our data and remove all those who actually had gone halfway through or 2/3 through the survey, but actually realized from the questions that this survey was not for people who wanted to leave, but for people who had actually left. So they were abroad at the time of responding. And for us, that was important because we felt at that, if you think of that particular situation, a lot of people were thinking of leaving, but between thinking and doing it, there is, there is a big difference. Looking at the reasons for leaving, we had 3 or 4 in particular reasons that we grouped. We gave 12 options. They could choose more than one option, and then we grouped them into 4. So one was improving academic and professional training, professional opportunities in general for responsibility and growth in their job, poor employment prospects at country of origin, and particularly no future, the feeling of having no future in Greece or the other country of origin. But let me show you here, and I hope that since we are in Zoom and not in a real seminar, you can see also the smaller print. So here you can see how we further classified these different reasons why people left. And we looked at labor market, so their situation at their labor market, the wider context at origin, and then personal aspiration and development. So while of course the situation in terms of work and financial prospects was important, we found that it was not a decisive or not the only decisive factor. So we can see that while unemployment was important for many, it wasn't the only reason. And actually, I don't have for this presentation, I didn't look particularly at the, at the percentages of unemployed people within our sample, but I can tell you that unemployed people were less, certainly less than 50%. I think in Greece, they were probably 25 to 30%, but say in Italy, they were 10%. So people left before losing their job. They left actually in a way they were anticipating the disaster. They were afraid that they would lose their job, their company was not going well, or they would be experiencing, in any case, downwards professional and economic mobility. Many of them had suffered important cuts in their salaries. So they reacted proactively and moved before the worst would happen. A second aspect was the quality of life, so that they felt, and this is where particularly relative deprivation comes, they felt that things were not going well, and more particularly that the future didn't hold many good prospects for them in their own country. So both in general as the future in the country for all, but particularly for them as well. It's interesting that quality of life was shown to matter more for those less educated. And while those with a graduate diploma, it was 47% of our sample that had a master's and 14% that had a PhD. So those with a master's or a PhD gave more importance as a reason for leaving their own professional and and educational development. If we compare among the countries, we saw also that in the Greek data, Greeks were more worried compared to the other nationalities about their future and the future of the country. I think that comes as no surprise, as we all know that the crisis was particularly acute in Greece. And I think particularly if we compare with Italy, the crisis, of course, the perception of the people in both countries was probably that the crisis was acute, but I think by objective indicators in terms of unemployment and underemployment, or decrease of the GDP per capita or in general in the country, and other macroeconomic indicators, there was no comparison. Now, And then we looked a little bit closer to personal aspiration and development. And you can see here that for some, and actually we know those under 30 and those single, so not married, without a family, without children, there was also a certain sense of adventure. And generally, particularly again for those under 30, there was an aspiration for personal development. While those married and with children responsibility had more of a worry about what would happen to them because of the crisis. So I think what was interesting and quite surprising for us to find is, as I said, the fact that economic motivations were an important factor, but they were in a way completely intertwined with motivations that had to do with the future and quality of life, and also with how the respondents saw their reality within the country and their doubts and fears for the future. I would like to actually, I was telling Phil just before we started that just yesterday I got the final version of an article that a colleague of ours, Dissatisfaction, who actually I emailed her yesterday to say that I would be referring to her study, but unfortunately she couldn't be with us here today. So Evie is just now publishing the study that she conducted. It's a qualitative study with 24 respondents of recent Greek immigrants to Canada, particularly in Toronto and in Halifax. And she looked again at their motivations, the role of transnational networks, or of, for instance, migration policies for these people in coming to Canada. They're, I think, in a way similar to what we did in our survey, that of course was more of a quantitative study. She looked at both the motivations for leaving, but also the reasons why choosing a particular destination. And I have also to say, I didn't include it in the slides, in our own study, what we found, of course, is that the majority of people went to the EU. There was less than 10% that went to outside the EU countries. Within the EU, main destinations in our sample were the UK, Germany, and Belgium. For all the different Southern European countries. And I have to say that actually in the data that included Ireland, Ireland was the only, so people from Ireland were the only ones that chose, I think, by 30% to go to Australia or North America. So the other, from the Southern European countries, they went to European destinations. And also another element that we found in our study was that there was no connection between the earlier migration waves and the new migration waves. So we didn't find people who went, say, to Germany because their family members, so they had extended family members that were in Germany who had, say, migrated to Germany in the 60s or 70s. We found a net separation of the two migration waves. While this was not the case in Evie's study on Canada, where actually what Evie finds is that there, in the families that she looked at, there were rich migration histories and transnational family ties related to former migration. So I think at least 3 of her 24 respondents had been traveling actually back to Canada because of family members who lived here. Or in other cases, their parents had been in. So their parents, for instance, were born in Canada or had migrated to Canada, stayed for a number of years, and then went back to Greece when things were quite good in Greece. So when their grown-up children with their families decided to try their luck back in Canada, there was an understanding that migration is a way to improve your socioeconomic situation. A second element that Evie found that I think, again, is different from the intra-EU migration is the importance of the proactive immigration policy in Canada that we all know very well. And for instance, the possibility to find employment or business opportunities through contacts that you can make when you visit, or through appropriate websites of the government, through the provincial programs, opportunities for loans, etc. So that was not an element that we found in our study, But I think there too, one has to take into account the fact that in most, even the important destination countries in the EU, like say, again, Germany, France, or the UK, there's not such a proactive immigration policy. And also there was the fact that there people were moving, as I said, freely because of, or thanks to the EU citizenship. And a third element that she found was that people coming to Canada were particularly motivated by the long-term prospect of quality of life in Canada and, you know, a good life, good education, good health system, good, of course, labor market situation for them and their children, but less so this feeling of professional development, of particularly, you know, advancement in their profession, either through education or through the opportunity to taking up, you know, new professional positions here in Canada. Now, of course, I think the comparison between the two studies should be taken with a pinch of salt, because EVIS is a qualitative study that looks more into the agency of the migrants and into the way they combine the objective aspects with the subjective aspects of it. Our study included to some extent this element because we had several open-ended questions in our sample. But as you can imagine, the written, the kind of the genre of a written text where people type in their comment in an online survey is different compared to an oral qualitative interview. And I think I would like to conclude my presentation at that, and I'd be happy to hear your comments and questions or even further insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shanna. That was wonderful. We're going to start collecting questions now, so please use the question function of Zoom to post your questions, and we'll get to them in a moment. Before we do, I just wanted to ask you something that came to mind as I was listening, and that's to do with sort of cross-generational considerations, because that didn't seem to come across much in the analysis that you did with your colleagues based on the survey responses. But anecdotally, and I think I'm not the only one, I'm sure you've had these conversations, and many people in the audience will have had these conversations. You run into someone and you ask, well, you know, in one instance, we know a couple who were actually doing quite well in Greece and had jobs that were effectively recession-proof. And yet they still made the decision to leave those jobs and effectively reduce their position. They didn't come here. They came with the knowledge that they would be reducing rank, reducing status, reducing earnings, and giving quite a bit up. And the rationale was, at some point, I think roughly 2013, is most people say, any hope sort of gave up for our children. Yeah, the future, their future in Greece became not just a worry, but a threat, you know, that something had to be done, not so much for us, but for them. And that is something that echoes the sorts of reasons that one receives from an older generation. So the generation of my parents, many of the Greeks who came here may not have had formal education, but they did have skills that they were already using and were employed in Greece, and many came on the sort of personal development and aspiration grounds. But once they had children, they made not a formal calculation of cost and benefit, but more of a back of the envelope calculation that, listen, I've determined that in this place, I have very high quality education that is free. I have very high quality hospital and medical services that are provided by the state. And I have a level of infrastructure and dependability of public services that is simply just does not exist back home. So it's not so much that I'm making this decision in order to increase my earnings, but rather to increase the life prospects of my children. I'm wondering whether that in fact did come across in any of the responses to the survey in the analysis. I mean, I have to admit, I haven't read either of the papers that were published based on this survey data, but I will. Or if it didn't, what you have more generally to say about cross-generational decision-making.
Well, of course, I think, well, we all care about our children, but of course, it's not an easy decision to make, you know, and particularly to move from one continent to another. It's not that we're moving between neighboring countries, say from Canada to the US or from Italy to France. And I think it's a different kind of decision. I think definitely this kind of reasoning was hidden, if you want, in our survey data, or is apparent in the importance of quality of life considerations. I think that's where we capture this element. And actually, I was looking into the paper to see the quantitative data. So we see, and we also compared, because in our survey, we included people who had left before 2009. So we included everyone who was abroad, and also did run the analysis, you know, using 2009 as a cutoff point, although I agree with you, 2012 or 13 was probably, you know, actually that's what motivated us also, that it was the starkest, or if you want, the darkest year, because of that people at that stage, people were losing hope. And we see that actually, as I was saying, among those who left, only 60%, so 60% of those who left had employment at the time of migration overall. And also that quality of life is mentioned after 2009, quality of life is mentioned as an important factor by 61% of the people who are leaving. And what we see is those who, for those who emigrated after 2009, these considerations become more important. What I was saying, yes, the idea of the country having no future, or I have no future in this country. I think also from a quality perspective, I think what was, however, coming across more strongly in my view, and I think it relates to a question that I see in the questions and answers, is a dissatisfaction with how things are done in the country of origin. And I still remember a few of the, you know, the quotes, that the things that people had written. So I remember, I think one particular story, that was somebody from Italy who had moved to France or Belgium, and he was saying that, you know, in his previous job, he was never given responsibility. He had to plead to get to the job, you know, use networks, etc. And the relationship with other colleagues was very hierarchical. And when he applied and got this other job and moved at the destination country, he was immediately given responsibility and, you know, space to grow. So that was very, very important as a motivation. So, and that was something that most of the immigrants, and I'm saying not just the Greeks, but the other Southern Europeans, deplored about their countries of origin, in a way that they were almost infantilized or treated always as youngsters. Actually, also the element of age, that people who were younger in Greece and other Southern European countries were not given opportunities. I think in terms of the other issues, you know, like welfare, education, and you know, overall health coverage, they certainly play a role, but probably it's not, at least in our survey, it wasn't something that was specifically mentioned. So I'm going to Belgium or Germany or the UK because they have a better health system. No, that was not mentioned, or because they have a better education system. That is a good question. Of course, then why was not this mentioned?
Thank you. We've now have some questions. So we'll start. I'll just read it off. You mentioned that it's not the poor, uneducated people who emigrate from countries like Greece, Spain, or Portugal. Could we conclude that the driving force, not only one factor behind the exodus of educated people, could be quality of institutions, which is certainly higher and more stable in countries located north of the Tropic of Cancer? Of course, we can find a few exemptions like Australia, for example.
Yeah, as I said, yeah, definitely. I think the quality, of course, people want, I mean, we social scientists would say quality of institutions. People won't say that in a survey. They will not say, oh, it's the quality of institutions in my country, but very much, yeah, they express this feeling that things don't change, they cannot change them, and that there is, I mean, you know, networks, nepotism play a too important a role in hampering their capacity for, you know, further development and further growth, and generally, yeah, feeling that they don't trust institutions. We didn't particularly, now that I'm thinking about it, we didn't particularly compare, for instance, with other, for instance, with your Eurobarometer survey that every year has measurings of, you know, trust in national institutions, trust in European institutions, and even comparative trust between the two. But that would be a good, yeah, a good idea.
Our next question is, are you planning to follow up to see how many of the respondents went back to their home country?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I mean, no, we haven't. No, we haven't done a follow-up yet to the survey. No, that is a good question. I also want to mention something else, that in the EU, so while it is easier to track who has come to Canada and when and under what status, in the EU, the picture is more fuzzy because of the free movement, and because there's usually a delay between when you move and when you start appearing in statistics like Eurostat, you know, the European statistics. Because, for instance, you don't, in most countries, you don't need to register that you're leaving. To the best of my knowledge, at least for the Southern European countries, the only country where you have an interest in telling your country you live in is Italy, because they have something called, what is it called? Italian. So it's something called like the Association of Italians Abroad, and it's linked to the consulates. And there could be, you know, facilitations in terms of bureaucratic issues, etc. So you have an interest in registering. For instance, if you live in Greece or Spain, you have no interest to go to, I don't even know where you would go to say, you know, bye guys, I'm leaving. Then when you go to the new EU country, it may take time until you get employed, until you do all your papers, or you register with your municipality, until you start appearing as having established there. And also what we have seen in our survey, there were several cases where people, so for instance, one of the two parents moved, got a job, say in Germany, the family stayed in Greece. So more often than not, it would be, say, the wife and kids that stayed in Greece. So they were kind of checking whether the situation is such so that the whole family should move, or whether they would, I mean, so one, say the father would stay for a year and then come back. So in these cases, this kind of mobility is usually not registered in statistics. It would be important, in my view, and from a methodological perspective, this would be typically a study for a respondent-driven survey. So respondent-driven sampling, whether online, well, online would be the most feasible case, where you ask someone to refer at least 3 people who they know, who satisfy the criteria and who are different. So they shouldn't refer their 3 best friends who have some similar biographies, and try and see how long people stayed, whether they went back and why they went back. Mm-hmm. And sorry, may I add something to this? Actually, the studies by Lois Labrianidis are very interesting in this respect. And he had done a book just before that. Actually, his book was published in 2011. And it was called, for those who speak Greek, Επενδύοντας στη φυγή, so investing in living. And then he did some follow-up studies. So the early book, what it basically says is that people are living. So actually, it says that people are leaving because they go abroad for education or other such opportunities. and then they don't go back because they have better prospects at destination. But what he also finds is people go back because, for instance, oftentimes young men, because they go back to do their military service and then they end up staying, they get married. There are, how can I say, non-monetary, how can I say, contributions that are made by the family at origin that make it up for the loss in income. However, I think what we find during the crisis is that the monetary losses and the unemployment and the fear of a deterioration of quality of life become stronger for this same type of people, and I'm talking again middle class people, than the possible, how can I say, profits or the possible support they can have.
No, and some of the information that you presented at the beginning of your talk, I mean, it's really monumental. It's not a recession or a slowdown or a dip in the economy. This is a generational catastrophe, so I mean, not only was hope drying up, but savings were drying up. So this idea of the younger generations falling back on parents and even grandparents, that informal social safety net of Southern European non-family policy, that was stretched to the limit and ultimately collapsed. I've not studied this, but I think in terms of motivational factors, there's loss of hope is a complicated concept. And hope can sometimes be the hope of holding on or drawing support from an informal network, not from the state, because even when it wasn't bankrupt, it wasn't doing a very good job, but from your personal networks, your familial networks. And the crisis was so profound that even those networks were tapped out in many instances for lower income and median income Greeks.
Yeah, and I think, of course, I mean, we all know the classical analysis of society and economy in Greece. It's also that the state was a big factor in Greece in terms of, middle class accommodation. So educated children finding a job in the public sector, politicians using this to influence voters. This kind of resource dried up, and although this now may seem kind of logical, in 2010 it seemed like it just cannot happen.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. Well, we've got a whole cascade of questions now. So the next one is, can family size be a factor explaining relatively low Greek emigration? So the puzzle you started with. One might imagine that in a single child families, parental pressure to remain home would be greater than multiple child families. And with fertility rates among the lowest in Europe, the incidence of single child families in Greece would tend to be relatively high.
Okay, just for comparative purposes, let me tell you that the fertility rates in Spain and Italy are lower than in Greece. Of course, I think in Greece it's 1.5, and in Spain and Italy it's 1.4 or 1.3. So anyhow, we're there. And in Germany, for instance, fertility rates are very low as well. Now, I think, good question, was being a single child. We didn't check that in our research. If you ask me, if that was a factor, it probably was, and it would be interesting to see if those who left were, children of single child families or children from families with more people. That would be an interesting factor, and also in terms of the resources that then the parents / grandparents could mobilize for creating the support networks that we were speaking about. If you ask me generally why I think Greeks did not leave, in my view, it's a combination. First of all, the crisis was terrible by comparison to the Greek standards in the 2000s. So we should not forget the period that preceded this crisis. So, and the So the relative deprivation, I think, actually has to do also in comparison with what middle-class people or university education people do in other European countries. So that for people it had become normal to travel, for the family to have 2 cars, to own their house, to be able to afford certain things for their children. So it was a notion of such relative deprivation, but it also had to do with, I mean, Greece in the years 2000, they had experienced a very good period, particularly between 2000 and 2005, with high growth, high employment. Of course, a stagnant structural unemployment that persisted, even when the country was absorbing a significant number of immigrant workers. And that's a typical pattern in Southern Europe that probably several of you are familiar with, where there is a structural persistent unemployment of people who don't get jobs because they're not commensurate to their level of education or expectation, but these jobs go unfilled, so they are filled by immigrants. I think that was a point. And the other point is that despite this stark feeling of being deprived, the crisis still did not reach the level that we saw in Central and Eastern Europe in the early 1990s. And I have done particularly myself quite a bit of work on gendered migration from Central and Eastern Europe in the 1990s. And we've seen really, grandmothers, 55, 60, 65 years old, becoming undocumented domestic workers and cleaners in Southern Europe and Western Europe. So I think that should also put the crisis a little bit into context, that by the Greek standards of the 2000s, the situation was much worsened, but it wasn't that the whole thing was collapsing.
Right. Yeah, important to note. Our next question asks about whether you can recommend any research on the experiences of Greek immigrants in Canada with respect to settlement and integration. So not necessarily what drove them to make the decision, the migration part, but the post-migration experience, and whether you're aware of any factors that contribute more to successful settlement.
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I'm not aware of any research. And actually, as I said yesterday in my brief conversation over email with Evita Sorlu, she was also mentioning, that she wasn't aware. And that would be an interesting topic to look at. Again, from very anecdotal evidence, I would think new immigrants from Greece and Canada who have come as a result of the crisis, in my view, this is not confirmed by Evi's study, but in my view, include a lot of people who had papers to come to Canada. So people generally did not apply for permanent residency or for temporary work permits, but rather it was people who were citizens because they were born here, or the spouse was a citizen. So of course that gave the possibility for the whole family to come. Of course, in some cases, I would think they were also highly educated people who, through professional networks, found jobs. And it's interesting, for instance, in our survey, nearly 50% of the people worked in jobs related to engineering and construction. This is no surprise because the crisis was first a crisis in the construction sector in all the Southern European countries. So this is what I can say. Unfortunately, I don't know of any study that is looking, for instance, at patterns of socioeconomic advancement. Now, of course, you probably know that in general, immigration studies with regard to how newcomers are doing in Canada, we find that people who had what is called previous Canadian earnings, so people who transitioned to permanent residency after having been temporary work permit holders here, previous Canadian earnings, when they're high, they translate into a high trajectory, into a positive socioeconomic trajectory. So people do not experience the slump. So when they land, they had so basically they were working in Canada in a highly skilled job. Second thing that we find is that generally, for instance, for those from European countries fare better than those from non-European countries. And there, I think there's still, unfortunately, a persistent effect in Canada of, racialization. So perhaps we need to put the Greek experience into this context.
Yeah, I would agree. Our next question. Oh, this one is, you don't have to defend them, but the member of the audience is asking, was Labrinidis exaggerating the size of the brain drain? The numbers of well-educated migrants he reported did not seem to be borne by the evidence. Do we have any data about the ratio of well-educated versus not as well-educated?
Yeah, good question. No, I do believe that particularly in the EU, the vast majority of those who left were highly educated. So university, or at least technical university, so the equivalent of college here, and more. And I think that clearly for those who went to the EU, because of the EU citizenship and because of the smoothness, again, think moving from Ontario to Saskatchewan or Alberta or, I don't know, Nova Scotia. It's as smooth as that, particularly in the last decade. I personally started moving within the EU in the 1990s. In the 1990s, it wasn't as smooth. Still, it was smoother for EU citizens compared to non-EU citizens. But still, there were several bureaucratic steps that you had to take for registration, etc., with the police. While now it's all pretty much streamlined in terms of also transferring your health coverage. I think for pension, it will be more of a, when these intra-EU migrants, whether they stay or they come back, will try to get their pension rights together. That will be more of a nightmare. But I think in terms of transferring health, transferring your kids in school, it's pretty smooth. And it was clearly motivated by people realizing that with the same education, same professional qualifications, they could do better. And it was not driven, the intra-EU migration, it was not driven by sheer poverty and unemployment, like the migration in the 60s and 70s when people left to go to Germany or to Belgium to work in the factories and in the mines. In terms of, I think what has been exaggerated in some years in the mid-2010s was the size of the brain drain. So that I remember there was a study that was sometimes when a number comes up, say in a newspaper article where they say the study by, I don't know, company so-and-so or think tank so-and-so says 500,000 highly skilled migrants have left the country in the last 2 years. And then this number takes a life of its own and everyone quotes perhaps the newspaper article that quote, and then you go look for the study and you find that it is it happened to me particularly with regard to this migration, you go find that it's a PowerPoint from an unknown and non-existent probably think tank or some sort of organization that was available on the internet. And I think there was, however, a good study by the National Bank of Greece at a certain point, which actually quantified the number of people at about 200,000. And I think 200,000 seems to me much more plausible. And I think the studies by Lois Labrianidis and his collaborators and co-authors are around the same number.
You anticipated and answered the same audience member's follow-up question. So you can go to the next question now. And this is an interesting question. So we talk about highly skilled immigration and education as a feature of skilled people, but the audience member is asking whether the type of educational or professional background plays a role with respect to relative ease of transition. So their example is humanities versus technical backgrounds. So I know some would answer immediately that if you have a technical, let's say engineering or biosciences or something, you're more likely to succeed. But as you know, there's a cohort of very bright Canadian scholars who argue the contrary, that it doesn't make much difference really. It's education is a proxy for flexibility, and in a modern economy, flexibility is what counts. So this is an interesting theoretical question for you to grapple with.
Yeah, I think, as I said, I think we didn't have results on whether, I think our results indicate that those who left, as I was saying, so construction and engineering are overrepresented. And they are overrepresented because these sectors were really facing an acute crisis in the early 2010s. I'd like to remind us that the big real estate bubble was in Spain, even more than in Greece. So the whole sector collapsed, and so people started looking for jobs abroad. I'm not sure, and I'm not sure that we would find a distinction between, for instance, the STEM and others, because also, again, there would be a lot of people working in different service sectors, in sales and business and service provision, all sorts of kind of skilled service provision in different sectors.
Mm. Okay, so how do you see, I know it departs from the data and the evidence that you've been drawing from for your presentation, but what, if anything, has changed more recently in Greece with respect to migration patterns?
No, I think definitely, in a way, probably the situation plateaued at around 2015. So those who wanted to leave had left, and those who stayed. Now, the big question is what happens now because of the current situation. As you know, Greece by 2019 was running a surplus, a fiscal surplus, thanks to the austerity policies. Now, this fiscal surplus doesn't necessarily mean that the country's economy was restructured and booming, but it was certainly good news. And right now, it remains to be seen what happens after the pandemic, because the cost of the pandemic is high. At the same time, I think the EU has shown a significant level of acting together and in solidarity towards one another. And there is an important package that was voted last year to help the countries that have been afflicted most by the pandemic. Of course, the big beneficiary of this package is Italy, because it had been hit harder, but Greece too is a beneficiary. I don't remember very well now however, the composition of the package, because part of it is loans and part of it is money given, so that will not be returned. And again, of course, I have to say I cannot help put into it, so also because the previous 10 years of my life that I lived in Italy, and knowing what was the public debt level in Italy, and then hearing what will be the public debt level in Canada after the pandemic, I'm still not kind of, I still don't lose my color. I don't faint when I hear it, because it still seems low to me. Obviously, because Canada was in a very good fiscal situation when the pandemic started. I think the problem with Greece is, and I can say, and I'm sure many of us can say also anecdotal evidence by family and friends, I don't think anyone has looked at new emigration. So that people suddenly, just when they had started thinking, we are into a good course, the pandemic hit. And as you were saying before, also feel there's no, there are no savings anymore. There is no cushion. There's nothing to how can I say, to affect the shock anymore after these last 10 years and the bumps of the Eurozone crisis. So that is on the other hand, an interesting thing would be if, in a couple of years' time or 3 years' time, hoping that we'll leave the pandemic, all of us will leave it behind us, to see how this element plays out, because this is contrary to the financial crisis of 2008-9 and to the Eurozone crisis. the pandemic crisis is a crisis felt by all the countries. And there's also this feeling that it's no one's fault, or certainly it's not the government's fault, the Greek, Italian, French, or Canadian government's fault. And I think that would be interesting that we see how it plays out in terms of faith in institutions, trust in institutions, trust in the future of the country, and the capacity of the country to turn this over.
That's, I think, a fitting point to conclude, and to thank you so much for this really wonderful talk, and to thank our audience for very probing and thoughtful questions. So with that, we'll conclude this installment of our seminar series in the Hellenic Studies program at the University of Toronto. And on behalf of Professor Triandafyllidou, I wish you a nice afternoon, a great evening, and all the best moving forward.
Thank you very much, Phil, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here with us today. Bye.
Bye.